Deputy Executive Director and General Counsel of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We have Nate Cardozo, yes, please raise your hand, Staff Attorney on the Electronic Frontier Foundation Digital Civil Liberties Team, and Andrew Crocker, who is a Staff Attorney on the Electronic Frontier Foundation Civil Liberties Team, and you get to introduce the rest of them. Good stuff.
Hello. So, yes, we in addition to our Coders' Rights legal team, we have some of our technologists from EFF with us as well. Bill Buddington, and Cooper Quinton, and Noah Swartz. So we're going to do a brief introduction. Each of us will say a little bit about what we've been working on, and then we'll open it up to your questions. We brought our technologists on the stage so you can ask questions about our technology projects as well as some of the legal issues. As usual, if you've been to one of these before, we have some, suggestions on how questions are. First of all, that while one of the things we do at the Coders' Rights Project is provide legal counsel for free to security researchers, this is not the forum to ask questions about your legal advice. That should be done in a private conversation at another place and another time. So we welcome your questions, and they can certainly touch upon legal issues. But if it is specifically about something that you're doing or planning to doing, or wondering if it would be legal if you did, that those are questions that should be done privately. So let me give a brief introduction to myself. So my name is Kurt Opsahl. I'm an attorney with EFF. I work on our Coders' Rights Project. And as I just said, that's where we provide some legal advice and counseling to security researchers. I wanted to touch on briefly something that some of you may have heard about, that we are representing Chris Roberts, and he is a security researcher. Hey, Chris. And was recently detained by the FBI after tweeting during a flight about some security issues. And we're going to try to help him navigate that situation. That said, we're not going to do too much talking about that in this session, so we'll ask not to do questions on that topic during this Ask the EFF. And with that, we'll try and keep our introductions short, so I will pass the mic to Bill.
Hi there. My name is Bill Buddington. I am a software engineer at the EFF. I've worked on various projects. One of the primary projects I've been working on over the past year is called Phantom DC. It's something that basically takes Congress and kicking and screaming wraps them in an API because they don't like that. But we find it important to have the tools of democracy be in the public sphere. So we want that to be a tool that's easily usable by everyone. We've deployed it, and various other organizations in our same space have deployed it. And it's something that I feel like is a very important project for open sourcing democracy. I've also worked a little bit on Let's Encrypt, the client side of Let's Encrypt. Let's Encrypt is a project that basically brings the process of getting SSL certificates, makes it much easier to do, makes it a much more streamlined process, and also makes it a free process. So sysadmins that want to deploy SSL on sites that they run can do so in a timely and efficient manner, and also has all the security guarantees that TLS and SSL currently have. So those are a few of the projects I've been working on, and with that, I'll pass it over to Nate.
I'm Nate Cardozo. I'm a staff attorney at EFF. I work on the Coders' Rights team with Kurt and Andrew, and I'm one of the lawyers representing Chris. I do a number of other projects at EFF. All of my work focuses on free speech and privacy. I'm suing the government of Ethiopia for wiretapping. They owned the computer of an American citizen in Silver Spring, Maryland, and wiretapped his Skype calls, and I'm going to argue that case in a couple of months. We don't have a date yet. I also work on EFF's Who Has Your Back report. This is the big chart where we recognize companies that have best practices in terms of protecting your data against government overreach. So I get to be on the nice calls with the companies where they yell and scream at me when I tell them I'm not going to give them a gold star. It's amazing the lengths that companies will go for what we all used to like to get in kindergarten. The gold star has worth. I don't know why exactly, but it does. So those are the things that I do at EFF. And now Cooper.
Hi, I'm Cooper Quinton. I'm a staff technologist at EFF. I work on a number of different projects. My main project is Privacy Badger, which is our browser extension to block creepy third-party tracking online. I also work on HTTPS Everywhere, which is our browser extension that tries to get you to use HTTPS whenever possible. I do web and privacy research. And another project that I've been working on recently is called Canary Watch, which is a website and a tool that will track warrant canaries for changes and takedowns. What's a warrant canary? A warrant canary is first I should explain what a national security letter is. A national security letter is a FBI order. They're a court order that the DOJ can send you, and which orders you to give up business documents, communications of your customers, essentially. Subscriber information. Thank you. That national security letter also has a gag order attached to it, which says that you can't tell anybody other than your lawyer that you've received this national security letter. And that gag order isn't overseen by a judge. This is the only process of this type. Any random special agent in charge of an investigation, an FBI investigation, can send you this process and gag you from talking about it. So a warrant canary is a piece of text on your website or wherever else that says, we have not received any national security letters. And if you do receive a national security letter, you could take that down or stop updating it. So Canary Watch watches these warrant canaries for changes and takedowns. So that's another project that I work on.
Thanks. I'm Andrew Crocker. I'm a staff attorney at EFF. Was previously a fellow, so I'm the newest staff attorney. And I work on the Coders' Rights Project with Nate and Kurt. I also do a lot of work on our national security and mass surveillance cases. I'm sure many of you are familiar with our cases against the NSA and their various forms of mass surveillance. One that's new in that area and maybe read in the Wall Street Journal in January or more recently in the USA Today, that the DEA is also engaged in mass surveillance. They've collected all of Americans' phone calls to various countries for a very long time, since the early 90s. And in fact, this program that they've been running since the 90s was the inspiration for the NSA's phone records tracking program. And so we at EFF wanted to do something about that, and with our friends at Human Rights Watch, we just filed suit against the DEA, and we're trying to make sure that program is fully stopped. The DEA has said some things about how it's concluded it very conveniently right after Edward Snowden came out. So we're gonna get to the bottom of that with Human Rights Watch.
I'm Noah Swartz. I'm also a staff technologist at the EFF. I work on Privacy Badger with Cooper. Privacy Badger is a browser extension that tries to watch for third-party resources on websites giving you tracking cookies or cookies that can uniquely identify you. It blocks you from getting these cookies in the first place, and it blocks requests from these websites if it notices that they're tracking you across multiple domains. So as you go and read the New York Times and CNN and ABC, if the same resource is trying to look at which articles you're reading on all of those sites, it stops accepting requests from them so they can't see what you're reading online or what websites you're going to. Additionally, I work on this Privacy Lab, which is sort of an outreach program for people working on privacy tools or who do privacy activism. We have an event coming up April 23rd at the Mozilla office. And if you'd like to go to that, I highly recommend it. You can find more information at wiki.mozilla.org/privacy/privacy_lab. And I'd like to see all of you there.
All right, so that was our brief introduction. So we would like to start answering your questions. If you have any, we have the mic out there for people to ask amplified questions. So let me see. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask EFF? Oh, come on. You know you got a question. All right, Chris? That is an excellent question. How do you get hold of EFF if you get into trouble? The best way to do it is actually to email info@eff.org. We have a full-time intake coordinator who tracks all those emails coming in, works with the internal teams to find the appropriate person to respond. In some instances, we'll be able to represent people directly. In other instances, we will refer to additional counsel who you can work with. Unfortunately, we do not have the bandwidth to take all the requests that we receive, but we do our best to make sure that people are in good hands.
Hi.
Hello.
I work at a small startup here in San Francisco, and what I was wondering is, do you have some self-service documents that we could provide to our legal department, our developers, our marketing people, so that we as an organization, rather than maybe doing an ad hoc job of trying to take care of people's privacy, that we're actually being a little bit more uniformly holistic about it?
So thank you. I'll address at least some of that, which is sort of. We have some things like white paper on best practices for logging. And you can look to that to see what would be some good practices there. We don't have something like a standard privacy policy because we actually think that you shouldn't have a standard one. The privacy policy describes what a particular company does, and it's going to vary company by company. But for some of the best practices on how to protect your user, we have Who Has Your Back, and let me turn this over to Nate to explain a little bit about what we look for in that.
So yeah, as Kurt mentioned, we do have a white paper on online service providers' best practices, so definitely check that out. And then in terms of the Who Has Your Back report, we try and say what we think best practices are in terms of protecting user data. Always require a warrant before turning over content. Always notify your user before turning over content and give the user an opportunity to contest it. Unless, of course, you're gagged, then you have to follow the gag. Things like that. And then be transparent. Tell your users what your policies are. One of the things that we recommend early stage startups do is wrap their heads around what they're going to do the first time they get legal process. Have a plan. You don't necessarily have to have fully fleshed out policies, but you do need to know in general what you're going to do. And if what you're going to do is call EFF, that's great. Make sure your frontline employees know that that's the plan. If your policy is call outside counsel, make sure that the frontline employees know that that's the policy, and make sure they know that they're going to do that before they comply with the process.
Additionally, if your startup is something that provides a service to people and you collect data about the users of your product, Privacy Badger includes in it a do not track policy, which we think respects users' privacy, and it's standards for how to anonymize data and how long to retain it, and additional sort of privacy practices that we as the EFF think are good. And if you do so, then Privacy Badger will allow you to use cookies for session information. So if you are providing a service, it's something that you should read, and hopefully I'll let Cooper.
I was going to say the do not track policy document is if you're providing a third-party service. If your product is being embedded in other people's websites, this will indicate that you do respect do not track and a very specific set of standards for that.
So there's been a lot of bills in front of Congress right now. They're calling it Cyber Legislation Week. There's been a bunch of different activities from different groups opposing or supporting the various bills in Congress. I haven't seen a lot of work from the EFF on these bills, and I'm wondering if you guys, or maybe I missed it, I'm wondering if you guys think that being in San Francisco has isolated you from the power elite in Washington, and if you need a bigger presence in D.C.
So most of the work that we do, that we're doing right now at least, is behind the scenes. Mark Jaycox, who's trying to hide behind that banner back there, is our full-time legislative analyst. He's on calls most of the day, every day. Kurt and I are working with a number of different groups. But at this point, it's very much behind the scenes. I'm not sure there's anything we support right now that's in Congress. So I guess 215 DAuth is.
Do you think that you need to have a bigger presence in Washington to be more effective or not? Or are you okay out here on San Francisco?
We are okay out here in beautiful sunny San Francisco. So this is a little bit of different strategies. That there's ways in which you can influence policies that are sort of an inside play when you're in DC, and there are ways that you can do outside. So we attempt to try and make the world a better place, make a future that we want to live in through more of an outside play. So we get a lot of grassroots activism. This is a little bit of what Bill was talking about, making it easier for constituents to get in touch with their representatives and tell them what they think are important to them, and legislatures listen to that. We also try and put out policy positions, explain our positions in blog posts, and we have done so on some of these cybersecurity bills that are coming up. A lot of that was around the time they were first proposed by the White House. So this was in January sometime. But we've also been sort of active in trying to get a grassroots support or opposition to bills. We have connections in D.C., but there's also an insider strategy, and there are groups based in D.C. who do more of that. They have more direct meetings with legislatures and with their staff, and there's value to that approach as well. If you're familiar with the Center for Democracy and Technology, or CDT, they are based in D.C. They do more of that approach. And as you may know, or may not, because it's getting to be kind of old history now, but there was a split at one point where a portion of EFF went and founded CDT, wanting to pursue more of that strategy, while a portion of EFF kept the name and moved to San Francisco to do more of an outsider litigation and grassroots strategy. And I think there's a place in the ecosystem for both.
It's also important, and an activism team at EFF can tell you this a lot better than I can, to build coalitions that can get the job done together. So we work with, as you said, CDT and other organizations such as the Sunlight Foundation that are situated in the Beltway, so that we can more effectively reach out to the legislative bodies that do exist. Basically, whenever I go up to the activism portion of the building, they're always basically on the phone with coalition building, creating those links that are important to actually get the word out. And you can visit our website, act.eff.org. We have a number of actions that are available that you can take part in that are calling for any number of things. For instance, stopping the mass bulk collection by the NSA, or stopping the new CISA bill, or any number of things. The technology that makes that possible is something that we've been building through our Action Center, and a lot of the organizations in the Beltway are using that now too. And also, so the Action Center is one, and there's a piece of like micro infrastructure, I would say, called, and I've been working very closely on this part, called Phantom DC, which is Phantom of the Capitol. And it's basically something that wraps the process of filling out congressional forms in an API, as I said. So the server actually goes out and through Phantom JS fills out forms for the end user and common sizes. So you know, typically if you're targeting the Senate and the House, you have to know your zip+4. You have to fill out your first name 3 times for each one of your members of Congress. You have to know who your members of Congress are. A lot of zip codes are split in that. So this kind of process is very arduous for most people just trying to get in contact with their reps. This has been streamlined, and this problem has basically been fixed by open sourcing the tools of democracy, not through any congressional action, but through grassroots activism, making it possible for us to get in contact with our reps. So, and I'm happy to talk about any of the technology stack that is involved there as well.
I was saying, do you guys have anything to say about the upcoming Patriot Act reauthorization in a few months or whatever?
Sure. So the question was about the upcoming, I guess, well, I would phrase it the upcoming sunset of Section 215 of the Patriot Act. The question, of course, is whether it will be reauthorized. So Section 215 of the Patriot Act it was first enacted along with the rest of the Patriot Act in the wake of 9/11 on October 2001. And the provision said that it empowered the government to obtain some records, some tangible things, actually was the term, and to do so with a less than the sort of the ordinary process. And at the time when it was passed, it was known as the library provision. The fear of civil libertarians was that the government would use this to obtain library records, look at what books you checked out, and maybe make some assumptions about what your intents or behavior were based on your library books, and it was opposed at that time. And I could sort of only imagine that the government was sort of, chortling when they saw this, because in fact they were using it for something else and far more expansive and I would say nefarious. Under this section, they started in around 2004 to issue 215 orders to various telecommunication service providers, saying that they want all the records of all your customers' calls, foreign and domestic, local included, every 90 days, and then they would issue another one the next 90 days. This was the telephone records program. Previous to 2004, they had been doing this based upon the executive authority, the president's sort of inherent power as a president. It turns out that wasn't a particularly strong legal basis. There was a big debate within the government about whether that was good enough, which led to threats of resignation from the Attorney General and the then director of the FBI. And so eventually they decided to switch it, not to stop the program, but to come up with a, well, shall we say, creative legal argument that this Section 215 provided that authority. And then for the years since, they've been gobbling up all of your records of all of the calls. Oh. All right. And so as things were done in the Patriot Act, and is often done when there are provisions that are heartily argued against by people who are concerned about civil liberties, they say, well, we're in a special time right now, but I'll tell you what, we'll put a sunset provision in it so that on its own authority it will expire after a certain period of time. And this section will expire on June 1st unless Congress does something to reauthorize it. And what has happened since it was last reauthorized and today is that the Edward Snowden leaks have revealed in some glorious detail what had been reported on in the news previously, but now we got to see the actual orders to, for example, Verizon Business Services, showing a 90-day order for all of the records. And this has made it so many people, ourselves included, have been saying that we should not reauthorize this. It was a bad idea. It wasn't what the intent. Even the author of the Patriot Act would concede that this was not what was intended by this bill. And so this is now, if there's any time to do reforms and to try to rein in the government's power to look at all the records, now is that time. Nate?
And if you want to help the fight against 215, you can go to fight215.org. It's an EFF-led coalition of 32 different organizations who are trying desperately to make sure that 215 is not reauthorized on June 1st. So fight215.org. No, what? Mark is shaking his head. Never mind. It's fight215.org, isn't it? Okay, to end mass surveillance under the Patriot Act, hopefully also including not reauthorizing 215. Sure. Yeah, that's good enough. All right. Anyone else? More questions?
So what is the current status of the lawsuit against the LA Police Department and LA Sheriff's Department for 1 week's worth of license plate data? And how does the recent release of all the license plate reader data from the Oakland Police Department figure into that, if at all?
Okay, so background on the question, EFF and ACLU of Southern California sued the LA Sheriff's Department and the LA Police Department for 1 week's worth of ALPR, automatic license plate reader data, from a week during Ramadan a couple of years ago. The LA Sheriff and LAPD denied our request, saying that every single license plate capture in Los Angeles that week was part of an ongoing investigation, and that as such they didn't have to release the data, exempt under the California Public Records Act. We sued. We filed a petition for writ of mandate in Los Angeles Superior Court, lost at the district court level, and the appeal was heard last month or the month before. And I believe the California Court of Appeal has 90 days by statute to rule on that. So we'll get a ruling next month. Probably, they usually wait until the last day because they're judges and they can do that. So we'll get a ruling next month or so. How does the release of the Oakland data affect the case? Not at all. The Oakland PD had no problem releasing the same data that to Ars Technica and a reporter named Cyrus Farvar, who's a great guy and a good friend. That release makes no difference. Different agencies are allowed to interpret the law differently, and they're allowed to be completely arbitrary about it, and that makes no difference. Welcome to California Public Records Act law.
Oh. We also have a great visualization on our site of that Oakland data that's set as music. It sounds like you've heard it, but it's pretty cool.
Yeah, so I believe there are some within the EFF who have taken a position against the sale of exploits, like 0 days and whatnot, and you occasionally hear from some quarters accusations of hypocrisy on that, because you also say code is speech. So I wonder what you make of all this and whether EFF actually does have an institutional position on the sale of exploits.
All right, thank you for raising that. So first of all, absolutely, code is speech. This is something which is core to EFF, and we were part of the first case that addressed that. And so, and this has not been varied. And you know, if If there were to be a law that said that you could not talk about an exploit, give away an exploit, that law would face some serious First Amendment problems. What we've asked people to do, not so much as have a law to prevent this, but to think about whether the exploit would be best exposed as a vulnerability and trying to fix the problem. I mean, the concern is that if an exploit is being used improperly, and we have seen examples of where exploits have gone to governments, including our own, and been used in ways that are not freedom enhancing, but rather to increase surveillance and spying. And that is something that it would be better for society if we work together to try and identify vulnerabilities and get them fixed. And there's a balancing that can be done. And one of the things actually we are trying to find out a little bit more about is how the U.S. government does that balancing. That, you might say, look, the exploit is an O-day on a system that is only used by a foreign military, that, there's not much chance for consumer harm out of that, and that may be correct. But if it's an exploit on a, popular operating system that is, used by average civilians all around the world, that it is better off if we try and fix that vulnerability, because it could be found by others, it could be being exploited by others, and that the dangers inherent of having that exploit unpatched are greater dangers. So we actually did a Freedom of Information Act request to try and get more information about the government's vulnerability equities process, which I'll turn over to Andrew to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so after the Heartbleed revelations last April, I guess, there was a story now said to be false that the NSA knew about Heartbleed. And in response to that, the NSA and other parts of the government came out and said, no, we didn't know about Heartbleed, and in fact we have this policy that Kurt was mentioning, the vulnerabilities equities process, that helps us decide whether we should disclose a vulnerability that we find out about. We usually disclose, but in some rare cases we don't disclose it, and we use it for intelligence purposes. And that's about all they said about it. That led to us to file a Freedom of Information Act request. Unsurprisingly, they didn't respond to it, so we sued them. We sued the NSA and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And we've, because we sued them, received some documents, very, very few, that talk about the development of this process, but really don't go into any detail. I will say that tomorrow is the last release as part of our suit, so fingers crossed, maybe we'll see the policy and we'll know a whole lot more tomorrow morning about exactly how the government does this, but we'll have to wait and see. So far, it looks like they really don't have much of a policy in place. And we've seen other stories, aside from the Heartbleed story, notably one in The Intercept about the CIA's hacker jamboree, where they've used all kinds of vulnerabilities to hack Apple devices and others. And no mention in there or in any of the documents that went along with it of any kind of equities process. So we'll see.
And just to be clear, there is no law in the United States banning the sale of exploits. There is such a law in Europe, and that's called the Wassenaar Arrangement. The Wassenaar Arrangement has been signed but not ratified by the United States. It is not in force here. And we have spoken early and often, and will continue to do so, that the Wassenaar Arrangement, if adopted into United States domestic law, would violate the First Amendment as written. And it would have serious negative effects on this community. So the Wassenaar Arrangement, bad. I mean, not everything about Wassenaar is bad, but there are significant portions of Wassenaar. The portions that you guys care about are all bad. Next.
So I had a question about warrant canaries and how effective they actually are in determining whether or not a company has been served with an NSL. And kind of more specifically, is there ever a situation where, as part of the NSL, the government could stipulate that they have to continue the warrant canary in order to prevent people from finding out? Or if after the fact the government could, impose some fine or something like that for the use of a warrant canary?
So the short, I'll let Kurt give the long answer, but the short answer is warrant canaries have never been tested in court.
Okay.
But I'll give the longer answer. So, as an initial matter, I mean, a warrant canary is kind of an interesting thing. As Nate said, it hasn't been tested, and in a sense, it is a entity, a service provider, being as honest and transparent about the government process as the law allows. And so, if they have never received a national security letter, then they publish, for example, a transparency report, and you put 0 in the column for national security letters. And in a recent lawsuit concerning transparency about national security letters, the government conceded in their responsive papers that while they think it's a terrible idea and no one should do this, that it was not illegal to say 0 if you have never received a national security letter, and that that's right. The obligations that arise with a national security letter do not arise until you receive one. So then the interesting question arises, if you do receive them, then what? And so if you previously said 0, do you now have an obligation to lie to your customers and continue to say 0, even though this is now false? That is to say, can the government compel you to say false speech? And that is a question which hasn't been addressed in the warrant canary context. It has been addressed in several other contexts. So, for example, the government can compel you to say truthful speech from time to time. So, an example of where that has come up is smoking cigarette warnings, where you are compelled to put a warning on a pack of cigarettes if you're going to sell that in commerce. And another example that came up was that Planned Parenthood challenged a requirement that they tell people who were interested in getting an abortion that they would have an increased ideation of suicide if they did so, or at least that was likely. Planned Parenthood challenged that. One of the questions that the court addressed was there science behind this? Was this a truthful thing? They felt that it was sufficiently established as truthful, and then the Planned Parenthood was required to give out that information. And so it would be a fairly new thing if the government could compel false speech. However, not being tested in a national security context, the government would probably argue that perhaps that was important. The way that I would like to see this challenged is well in advance of the disclosure, so that if somebody had previously said 0 and then came into a circumstance where they got a national security letter, this would be a really great time to call your counsel. And if you don't have one, info@eff.org would be a good way to reach out, because it would be best to go to the court for a declaration of whether or not you are required to do this before the time period it comes where you either have to do it or not do it. And then there's some concern that if it's in an emergency situation and the FBI is telling the court, blood will be on your hands unless you require this, that courts do not necessarily want to do something that is radical and would change, endanger somebody without fully considering it. So we want to come at the court under the right circumstances. So I guess the longer answer to sum up is it hasn't been tested in court. Contact your counsel should this situation arise, and we will hope for the best.
And I think there was a second part to your question too, which is how reliable is it if a canary goes away? How certain can I be that this company did receive an NSL? And the answer is it depends. There are a lot of reasons a canary could go down, right? The person in charge of updating it, if it's a standalone canary, could forget to update it or be sick or be fired, right? If it's in a transparency report, other sections of the corporation might decide to change that transparency report for business reasons, or maybe their lawyers have advised them not to have a canary, and so they've removed it for that reason, right? So I think each case where there's a warrant canary and it changes or goes away needs to be taken into consideration on its own, right? And you can do things like reach out to the organization and say, hey, you had a warrant canary and it's changed. What happened there? And if they say, oh, we forgot to update it, then you know, right? Or if they say no comment, right, then you might have a better idea. But the deal is, you can't really ever know, right? And that's because of the gag order. There's, there is really no surefire way to tell. So, you just have to essentially do a little bit of threat modeling and decide whether or not it's worth the, how likely you think it is, and whether or not you want to continue using that service.
And just on a related note, we also are in the process of challenging the underlying gag as unconstitutional. So we represent 2 companies. We can't tell you their names because they're under gags. But both of them have challenged the gag order associated with an NSL that they have received. And we won at the first level of courts, where the court found it was an unconstitutional gag, but stayed its decision pending the government's appeal. The government, of course, did appeal. We argued that case before the Ninth Circuit, right here in San Francisco. I argued this case in October, just a few blocks from here at the Ninth Circuit building, and we are awaiting the court's decision. 6 months is not an unusual time frame, so we are hopeful that will come soon, but we don't know when it'll be. We just have, I think, 10 minutes, so time for 2 more questions, I think.
Sure. Yeah. So it seems like there appears to be quite a bit of momentum around new cybercrime laws in Washington, of which many may impact security researchers due to the broadening of the lack of definition and the technicalities of what we do. Can you kind of update the researchers on that, and what if there's anything we should be doing in the short term that may put us in harm's way?
Well, let me see how best to answer that. I mean, so we have a couple of proposals that have come out of the White House. One is the cyber information sharing bill, and that seems to have some momentum. Another is a set of changes to the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is sort of the primary anti-hacking law. That's probably the one that, as security researchers, you should be the most concerned about. And there's another one which is about reporting when there are security breaches. So you should at least pay attention to that one. And there are other processes which are underway. To focus sort of briefly on what I think is the one of most concern to this community, the White House has proposed a set of proposals which is actually similar to what they have proposed in the past. These are not new ideas, but they are adding the, oh my God, Sony just got hacked, you got to do something, cyber to it. And so that may give it a little bit more momentum. Now, none of the things that they have proposed, if they had been in place, would have made a difference in the Sony hack. It would not have helped. But, these sort of things don't necessarily matter in D.C. And it has a couple of provisions which are very concerning to us. One is that there was a provision which had talked about sharing of passwords, and they broadened that to talk about sharing of means of access, and this was not defined. There are certainly concerns that means of access is fairly broad. Like, when you're sharing a password, there are times when actually it can be quite legitimate to share a password. You might point out that a vulnerability is that this thing has this default password and so on. But nevertheless, it is a fairly narrow circumstance. Means of access, there are a lot of things when you're doing a proof of concept, an exploit, you could decide that to be a means of access. And so the limitation that they put on this is in not in so many words, that you're doing it sort of in a bad way. And doing it in a bad way is also much broader than doing something illegal. I would hopeful that of course no one would say that talking about a vulnerability is one of these bad ways because it embarrasses the company. but I don't want to give prosecutors the opportunity to make that argument. And then a second aspect of it is there's currently a provision about exceeding authorized access. And so this is when you have some forms of access to a system and then you exceed what you are given. And there are some ways of doing that which are kind of like hacking that may make sense to be in an anti-hacking law, where you're going past a technical protection method, you're escalating your privileges. And there are other ways of exceeding authorized access which are not technology-based. They're not hacking in any kind of traditional sense. And that is something like where there is a policy that says you shouldn't do that, but there is no technical reason why you should not. So this policy may be in a terms of use for the website, or it may be in an employee handbook that says what employees may do. And we've taken the position, and several circuit courts, appellate courts have agreed that you shouldn't criminalize what is essentially a breach of contract. Even if the terms of service of the 17 magazine online website says no one under 18 shall look at this site, it shouldn't be a felony if a 17-year-old goes and looks at 17 magazine. They've since changed that term from their position. So it's no longer a potential felony. But nevertheless, like we were pointing out some of these ridiculous things, and courts have agreed, and what the Department of Justice would like to do would be to change that so it is clearer that violations of terms of use and terms of service can be treated as exceeding authorized access. They put some limitations on that, but those limitations are not satisfactory. So as it stands, their CFAA proposal is a fairly dangerous piece of legislation if it is interpreted negatively. Obviously, if it did pass, we would go to the courts and try to get the courts to interpret it in a good manner. And but it'd be far better if it didn't pass. And we'll see. It hasn't gotten the kind of legs that some of the other provisions had. So we have 2 minutes left, so we'll give it one last question. Well,
where are you guys at with the battle with the ESA over the DMCA exception for museums when it comes to preserving old software and games?
The DMCA exemption process. Have either of you guys worked on that?
I don't think any of us on stage have. Oh, really?
Yeah. So we have been involved as an institution in the DMCA. The DMCA is a Digital Millennium Copyright Act. It has a every 3-year process where you can seek exemptions from rules that would otherwise prohibit you from hacking on DRM materials. And I believe that we have filed several comments seeking exemptions. I know that there was an exemption that was proposed that would allow for the preservation of old video games. But I have not worked on that project, some of my colleagues have, so I don't know whether we were directly involved in that or not. Oh, no one might know. All right, great.
I know a little. This is specifically with running like game servers or stuff for abandoned video games. And I think the state of it currently is that we submitted our comment. The games company submitted rebuttals. It was turned down, and I think there's an additional phase of comments going on. And I think we're going to resubmit to try to get it to pass. Otherwise, possibly do things outside of the normal DMCA exemption process to get it to pass.
On the previous question of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, it's important to note, and I'm not a lawyer, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, that there are local statutes as well that are subject to being overwritten by local law. In a recent case, there was an 8th grader in Florida who was charged with a felony for changing the background of his teacher's desktop. So this is, particularly egregious case, and this is because the minimum requirements of the law in Florida are that the perpetrator, the alleged perpetrator, should be charged with a felony rather than a misdemeanor. The CFAA mandates a misdemeanor be charged. So
Oh yeah, so I should have added just one other thing. Oh, well, never mind. We got the stop now, so all right, I'll just quickly add. One of the other changes in the White House proposal about the CFAA is they've basically eliminated misdemeanors. Everything is a felony with one or two small exceptions. And here's the thing: is that there are people who like to hack on computers and might be doing something that maybe we don't want to say is completely great, but it probably would be best if it could be charged as a misdemeanor so that they can go on and lead productive aspects of society afterwards. That having everything be a felony where the choice is either it's totally cool or it's a 5-year penalty, it really doesn't give the space for people to make a minor mistake, know that it was a mistake, and nevertheless be able to continue to be contributing members of society. All right, so thank you very much. We loved your questions. And thank you for coming to BSides.